Welcome to Russian History with Dr. Brovkin. I continue today with a series of lectures on the Russian Revolution and Civil War. And last time we talked about the decossakization or the massacre of the Cossacks that prepared the way for General Denikin to launch his historic offensive against Moscow. This is the year of 1919. This is the most crucial moment in the history of the Civil War when the so-called Whites, that's General Denikin, had a real chance to win in this war. Today I'd like to speak about the rest of the situation in Ukraine and southern Russia, and my thesis is very short. The offensive of General Denikin was made possible not only by the Cossack rebellion, which was crucial, but also by the rebellion of other peasant leaders, Makhno and the Zeleny and Grigoriev. All of these leaders we talked about earlier, they broke with the Bolsheviks and rebelled against them. But most importantly, it is because the population in the cities was totally antagonized by the ruthless terror of the Cheka and the gangs of all sorts that represented Bolshevik rule. So I think that the most important thing is the actual vivid picture of what was going on in southern Russia and Ukraine in the spring and summer of 1919. So here we go. Communist rule in Ukraine in 1919 was somewhat different than in Russia. First, it was established by the military conquest. Political situation in the Soviets as elected institutions were no longer there. The Communist Party was very weak in the cities and non-existent in the countryside. And the communist policies during this period of spring and summer 1919 was a replay of the worst excesses in the central Russia, which is requisitions, indemnities on the bourgeoisie, taking of hostages, and executions. The duration of Bolshevik rule varied from city to city. In Kharkov, it lasted from January to June, in Odessa from April to mid-August, and in Kiev till September. So a curious pattern repeated all over Ukrainian cities was that as soon as the communists entered, food prices tended to rise. This surely reflected the insecurity of the traders. The first thing the Bolsheviks did was to prohibit private trade. That, of course, severely limited the food supply and pushed prices higher. Now, as in Russia, the Bolsheviks believed that the defeated party in the class war, which was the bourgeoisie, which means people with property, people with education, the overthrown classes, had to pay an indemnity. This was done in Ukraine and southern Russia just as much as it was earlier practiced in Russia. So there was no difference, despite what some Ukrainian historians may claim. It was the same policy in Ukraine as it was in Russia. The bourgeoisie was a defeated class, according to the Bolsheviks, so Kiev, Kharkov, and Odessa were supposed to be robbed, just like the ruling classes were in Russia. Many of them were caught. Many of the people in these cities were Russian refugees from big cities in Moscow and Petrograd. They moved out south, and the Bolsheviks now got them after the withdrawal of the Germans and imposed so-called indemnities on the bourgeoisie. The campaign of expropriation of valuables from the so-called bourgeoisie in favor of the so-called working classes broadened from city to city. Red Guards and the Cheka gangs began searching block after block, apartment after apartment, confiscating clothes, food, and valuables. By mid-May, the Odessa Bolsheviks decided to regularize this mass expropriation and published an order. So I quote from a newspaper order from the Odessa newspaper. I quote, "In accordance with the decision of the Workers' Soviet, today, on May 13th, registration of property will begin according to the special questionnaire with the aim of expropriating from the property classes foodstuffs, shoes, clothing, money, valuables, and other items which are needed by the working people. Everyone is obligated to render assistance to this sacred task. Those who will not abide by the decree will be arrested immediately, and those who render resistance will be shot on the spot. So then they started requisitioning all this stuff, and the only thing that stopped it was that the working neighborhoods started to protest against mass robbery of, of workers as well. Several sources testified that those labeled the bourgeoisie were evicted from the apartments and drafted to perform hard labor for the workers' and peasants' government, as it was called. The Odessa Izvestia wrote, and I quote, "If we shoot several dozens of these scoundrels and fools, if we force them to clean the streets and their wives, to wash Red Army barracks, it's an honor for them. Then they will understand that our authority, our power is firm, and they should not pin their hopes on the English." The reference is to the English and French expeditionary force that landed in Odessa and that was now pushed out, and there were a lot of sympathies among the educated classes to those. Systematic searches of apartments and confiscations of furniture and clothes were also reported from Kharkov. Forcing wives of the so-called bourgeoisie to wash barracks must have been a widespread practice, since there was a reference to it in Kharkov, in Kiev, and even in faraway Perm province in the Urals. A recurring theme in many reports was that the bourgeois women were abused by Red Army soldiers in the barracks. In plain English, the Bolshevik rulers were thieves and rapists. And I would just like to get your imagination going. Suppose that you are in a city, in your apartment, you're a lawyer, you're a doctor, you're so-called bourgeoisie, educated classes, and then a gang runs in claiming to be Soviet power, and they rob you, and they take your wife and your daughter, and they send them to Red Army barracks where she is raped systematically. This is the reality of 1919 in Russia and in Ukraine. A typical scene at the time was that the Cheka detachment would burst into the apartment of lawyers and doctors and officer with the guns pointed at them. After the search, would confiscate valuables, take hostages, and draft women for so-called hard work. It was common knowledge that the Cheka agents kept much of the expropriated booty for themselves. In Kiev, the Cheka employed several hundred men. It had its own trucks, machine guns, and plenty of weapons and money. All sources indicate that executions started a couple of weeks after the Bolshevik takeover and intensified progressively as the communist hold on the country continued. According to the Georgian Menshevik, 200 people were executed as counter-revolutionaries during 1 month stay in Odessa. The total for Odessa is 13,000 executions. Red Terror was officially proclaimed as the Bolshevik policy in Ukraine after the fall of Kharkov on the 9th of June 1919 to General Denikin. The first page of the Cheka newspaper bears evidence with the poems praising Red Terror and threatening class enemies to the fact that the communists made no secret of their mass terror. The Odessa Izvestia published one of many threats to the bourgeoisie, and I quote, "The Red Terror has been set in motion, and it will start hitting the bourgeoisie neighborhoods. The bourgeoisie is going to crack under the bloody blows of the Red Terror." This is the official government Bolshevik newspaper of the time. Now, there's a lot of estimates of how many people were slaughtered in the summer months of 1919 as the Red Army was continuing its victorious march from Kharkov to Kiev and then to Odessa. In Kiev, the Red Rule lasted until the 28th of August, and the number of victims was greater. It is significant that an account of Red Terror made by the Red Cross Sisters of Mercy reiterates many of the essential procedural details reporting from Kharkov. These sisters had never been to Kharkov, could not have known that other witnesses reported, and yet their testimony is similar. According to their report, continuing executions took place. They went on during the night in July and August. By this date, it was by the last week was one of the wholesale slaughter. As in Kharkiv, there was a concentration camp for counter-revolutionaries with several hundred inmates, in addition to those kept in the Cheka itself. Um, Beginning on the 8th of August, the terror intensified since the Bolsheviks began to fear that they may have to leave Kiev. Anyone familiar with the Cheka-style collegium work in Russia would recognize the procedure as typical. It would be a few minutes. Collegium would glance at the case and then announce the verdict and then bring it to execution within minutes. No appeal, no lawyers, no proof, no nothing. It's just a few minutes. Now, the guiding principle was actually not the individual guilt, but the potentiality of somebody being against the Soviet power, against the power of the Bolsheviks, or class belonging. For example, the Red Cross sisters couldn't understand why Mr. Mankovsky, who used to own 6,000 desetin of land before the revolution, had to be shot. He didn't commit any crime. The reason was that the Bolsheviks considered him a kulak and therefore potentially dangerous, and therefore he had to be executed. The fate of another man, Mr. Birsky, was decided after only one question. Were you a mayor of Gomel? Yes. He was executed simply because he represented the ruling establishment of the overthrown bourgeoisie, just because he served as a mayor. A similar case was that of Mrs. Bobrovnikova, a landowner from the Chernigov province. The Sisters of Mercy described her last words, and I quote, "She was informed on her servant and imprisoned together with her infant child. With Mr. Bobrovnikova realized that death was inevitable. She flung herself on the floor, weeping, tore her hair, and implored mercy for her child's sake. But she was executed anyway." In 1919, in August, in Kiev, some victims were executed not as the basis of class origin, but simply because of the result of administrative fiat or personal arbitrary action of some Bolshevik rulers. One was a Soviet employee, Maria Gromova, a young and intelligent woman. She was a socialist, but probably not a Bolshevik. Her honestly rebelled against the cupidity and corruption of the commissars. Apparently, she had attempted to bring some charges against someone and was imprisoned for that. During her last days, she was terribly agitated. Her forbearance proved to be correct. She was shot by the communists. Now, all accounts, and I have in my book dozens and dozens and dozens of various sources, both Allied and German and Georgian and Russian and Ukrainian, of all kinds, essentially depict this horror story of gangs calling themselves the Cheka, the Extraordinary Commission of the Bolsheviks, doing mass executions. The procedure was that they would line them up, tell them to undress, and then shoot them with a machine gun or pistol shot in the head in those days of July and August 1919. The Bolsheviks were essentially at war with all groups of population in Ukraine, and yet without the movement of the White Army, all these diverse forces of the anti-Bolsheviks would probably not have been able to overthrow the Bolshevik regime. These forces were too disunited and to act in accord. There was little in common between the Don Cossacks, who had been counting on the Whites, the Denikin support, and Makhno rebels, who fought the Whites after they had finished with the Bolsheviks. There was little in common between the Mensheviks and Hussars, longtime opponents of the Bolsheviks, and the Cossacks, who disliked any type of socialists. There was very little in common between the Mensheviks and the Tsars and Makhno's rebels, even though all of them were left-wing socialist and anarchist enemies of the Bolsheviks. Yet, the Mensheviks and the Tsars were Russian, Jewish, and urban, and the Makhno people were peasant rebels, some of them with nationalist Ukrainian aspirations. There was no understanding between Makhno and Grigoriev. who represented socially and politically the same peasant constituency, Southern Russian and Ukrainian constituency. This was the same type of people, yet there were no understanding between Makhno and Ukrainian nationalists either. Makhno's forces fought against the independent Ukraine government on the side of the Bolsheviks. The Ukraine of 1919 had a very heterogeneous society, splintered into conflicting groups, nationality groups, urban versus rural, Russian versus Ukrainian, Cossack versus the Bolsheviks and the whites, as a great number of forces. They all detested the Bolsheviks, though. They all were absolutely turned any sympathy there may have been to the so-called Soviet power after the worst rule of the Cheka in this summer months. The movement of the White Army provided a catalyst from outside that finally toppled the communist rule. The army of 100,000 of the whites could not have possibly won the control over the territory of the population of 14 million people in 3 months if there had been no universal resentment of the preceding administration. That brings me to my overall main thesis. The spectacular advance of General Denikin was partly due to his military genius, and I will discuss that in the next video. But most importantly, in a civil war, the advance of the army was possible by total disrespect, antagonism that the Bolsheviks incursed in themselves by their bloodthirsty policies of armed gangs, robberies, and executions. September-October 1919 was perhaps the brightest months in the history of the white movement. The army continued its victorious offensive. One city fell after another. It was now at the end of summer in Russia proper. Tsaritsyn of the Volga, the Voronezh in southern Russia, Kursk, and Oryol were taken. Dispatches of local authorities in these cities betray a sense of hopelessness by the Bolsheviks. There were only a few of them left. Many of them were abandoned the city at the very rumor of the approaching of the white forces. The Voronezh Communist Telegraph, I quote, "The Voronezh Province Party Committee and the Soviet Executive Committee had abandoned the city on the 30th of September under the artillery shelling of the enemy. We consider it important to inform you that 2 days before abandoning the city, members of the City Party Committee began to flee without any authorization. In spite of all efforts to stop them, by the time we abandoned the city, there was only 30 or 40 people left to defend it. No one was willing to defend so-called Soviet power. The white offensive acquired a momentum of its own. Now, the very rumor of the whites' advance set the communists running and the peasants welcoming the liberators. And there were cheers all over Ukraine and southern Russia. Liberators and saviors, spasители and izbavители as they were called, as Denikin's forces triumphantly entered city after city, Kharkov, Odessa, and Kiev. A victory seemed to be close in these days of September-October 1919. Allied reports arrived to cover Denikin's triumphal entry into Moscow. It was only 200 miles away. Thank you very much, and in the next video we shall discuss the Denikin administration, his military skills, and what happened to this historic offensive that could have ended communist rule in Russia in 1919. Thank you.